Rock this world!
So sortition is the very old, very new, what would you call it, democratic process that's going to save America.
And the world, maybe.
And the world, maybe. Why don't you give me a little background on what sortition is?
Sortition is the idea of applying statistics to the scale problem of democracy. So the way that elections attempt to deal with scale is we select elite middlemen to sort of represent our interests. And the idea behind sortition is that there's characteristics about people who can win elections that make them very distinct from the people that they're attempting to represent. Certainly on economic interests, I would say most legislators are significantly different than the rest of us. And so sortition is a different approach that's actually much older and more aligned with the foundation of democracy that says, okay, the way we're going to deal with scale is we're going to take a representative sample of the people, and then through deliberation and kind of consensus building, they're going to come up with our policy decisions rather than elite middlemen. So it's democracy without politicians. Ancient Athenian democracy, in fact, used sortition. They did not use elections. Elections were used in very narrow pieces of their government to select generals, people who needed military expertise. But the people who were running the city day to day were selected by lot. And they actually developed this really interesting physical tool called a clarotarian, which they used to select people by random, sort of like an interesting old Powerball system. It had been forgotten about or really not discussed much for hundreds of years. It was used in Athens and then some Italian city-states in more of an oligarchic type format. And then just recently, starting in the 80s or 90s, it started to be unearthed and used again. And there's lots of cool examples of people using sortition in processes called citizens' assemblies to make political decisions. But of course, in the background, we've been using it for juries the whole time.
So it operates effectively kind of like jury selection, then, it sounds like?
The comparison with juries is sort of fraught because juries are really small, and there's also the problem of this thing called voir dire for juries, where lawyers can kick out people they don't like, and that's been used to sort of make sort of racist and classist and sexist removals from a jury before the jury actually gets to decide. So a more pure and democratic form of sortition would not allow that voir dire, and you would use a larger sample. But yeah, it is similar to juries, and absolutely, juries were developed separately in a couple different historical places, but the impetus behind the development was similar to the development of sortition. You're looking for a fair process that's going to try to minimize bias and also try to reflect the community's values, and there's that random selection component.
So you mentioned the problem with scale, and this being a way to solve issues with scale. I want to kind of just double tap on how elections kind of fail regular people, I suppose. What are the gaps that sortition hopefully can solve?
The conception of elections is that everybody has equal access to vote, but does everyone have equal access to run? And the answer is, of course, not. People who have to work, where it's not a choice for them to work, but their livelihood, their life depends on them working, or they have to caregive. Those people have less free time and therefore less ability to run in elections. And then anyone who's not wealthy has a handicap as far as this early process called the invisible primary. And that's a term that's used to connote when people are trying to attract donors and attract a sense that they are viable as candidates. That happens before anyone votes, right? When they decide who's going to show up on the presidential debate stage, it's all about how much money have you raised and what sort of name recognition do you have. And money pays for those things. Money can pay for name recognition, and money can pay for popularity early on in a race. Basically, elections work entirely against people who work or caregive or who are not wealthy or well-connected. Unless you are wealthy and well-connected and working and caregiving are options for you, you have a much lower probability of actually being electorally viable. So that's a huge argument against elections for their use to scale democracy. And ancient philosophers like Aristotle, as well as Montesquieu and Rousseau, they have these quotes where they say, it's in the nature of democracy to select decision makers by lot. And it's the nature of aristocracy or oligarchy to select decision makers based on election. When we use elections, this seems weird, and it's a huge mind flip for everyone who hears about this. No, elections are democracy. But I think there's a problem there when we equate the idea of elections and democracy, because ancient philosophers believed that elections were aristocratic for a reason. Elections and elite share a historical root word for a reason. Elections are there to select the best among us to make decisions on our behalf. And, like the founding fathers of the United States, they were not shy about their disdain for democracy. They say lots of negative things about democracy. It's tyranny. It's a riot. It's all these negative things about democracy. And if elections were democracy, why would these people who hated the idea of democracy incorporate elections into their system of government? They did not consider elections to be democratic. Elections were a tool that was used in monarchies to kind of select boards of advisors, or a parliament that would advise the king. And so really the history of elections is not democratic. It's not like George Washington invented elections to invent democracy when they started the United States. That's not the way elections work. They had been used historically to select our betters to make our decisions for us. And that's really antithetical to the idea that the common people should rule themselves.
That makes a lot of sense. I recall hearing back when I was in, high school, ages ago, millennia ago, how the founding fathers, during their time, most Americans couldn't vote. It was literally like white wealthy landowners, if I recall correctly. So
right.
that really makes a lot of sense, that they didn't trust the common people, and they didn't want to let the common people have a say in how their lives were dictated, really, more or less. So we've talked now about why sortition makes sense, maybe more than elections, for actually letting common people kind of manifest their destiny. Tell me more about how that actually works.
There's theoretical approaches, and there's a wide range of theoretical approaches for how sortition should be applied. And then there's also like practical implementations, like how has this actually been used? The way that it's been used most commonly right now are in these things called citizens' assemblies. And those are often advisory. They don't have real power. For me, I really think these processes have demonstrated their value empirically. The kind of stuff that comes out of citizens' assemblies, as well as the kind of stuff that comes out of juries, seems at least as good as what we get from politicians. I mean, we are currently in one of the longest government shutdowns in the United States history. I think the case that politicians are skilled and well at running a country, I don't think anyone is like staunchly standing behind that position. I think, there's a lot of problems, at least with the way the United States runs its country. And the empirical evidence from these citizens' assemblies processes, which use sortition, is really solid. There's a concern that comes up where people say, you're going to have random people make these decisions. They don't have the expertise to govern. Politicians don't have expertise necessarily in anything other than public relations, right? The only skill that you really need to have in order to get elected is public relations. You need to be a good bullshit artist. Basically, you need to be good at like selling the image of yourself as like, yep, I can lead. There's not necessarily like you have to demonstrate you actually can. You need to talk a good game, basically. And politicians, they of course can't be subject matter experts in all areas that they're governing, because the amount of human knowledge is just too vast. We all, no matter who's making the decisions, is going to rely on subject matter experts. Kind of the idea behind sortition is that, and there's this quote from Helene Landemore, who's a French philosopher and political theorist who has written a couple books about sortition. She says, experts should be on tap, but not on top. Like, you're going to hire the pilot to fly the plane, but you're not going to let the pilot pick the destination. The passengers should pick the destination, and then you can hire the pilot to get you where you want to go, right? As far as like citizen assemblies, how are they implemented? Usually what happens is there's like a multi-stage selection process where like mailers might go out to like 10,000 people to say like, hey, we're going to have this thing that's going to occur over a couple months. You're going to give up your Saturdays. We're going to pay you this much money. Would you be willing to participate? In order to include people in the most democratic and fair way, you need to like give people paid time off of work and pay them to participate, so that people who have jobs, have caregiving responsibilities, can participate. That's critical. And the best processes have all done that. So these mailers go out and then they say, okay, of the people who responded back, who we had the right address and they were willing, then they're going to randomly select from that pool. Generally, they've used what's called stratified sampling. So they say, okay, we know the population is about 50% male, 50% female. So we're going to ensure that we stratify this group and say 50% male, 50% female, and make sure that half of the sample that we take is male and female. And they might also they have stratified by age and income and other criteria like race as well. And I think that is for these voluntary processes that are really time intensive. I think that probably is the right approach, just because people are going to have to invest a lot of their time, and where these are not like an expectation of our society in the same way that juries are. I think it makes sense to say, hey, this should be a voluntary process and we're going to stratify so that we get a more accurate sample. In the future, if sortition is implemented more widely, like the final bodies that kind of decide whether or not a policy that's hammered out by these citizens' assemblies becomes law or not, maybe that could be a mandatory sample, more like jury duty. Because if it's voluntary, you're going to have some people say, nah, I'm too busy. And we still want to hear from those people, right? And yeah, there's a good criticism against that. Well, that's kind of coercive, but living under laws is coercive. I would rather do a little bit of coercion to like make sure we get laws that reflect what the general population would want, rather than have laws that come out that are crappy and then coerce everyone to follow those laws that are not what the community actually values. You know, with any government, there's some level of coercion. And I think if we're going to try to minimize coercion, might as well do it in the stage where we're actually making the laws rather than deciding and forcing people to follow them, right?
You were talking about, how the only thing you really need to win an election or to be an elected official is what I've heard kind of referenced as a type A personality. Generally, someone who's an extrovert, hyper competitive, just taking what you want and, whatever you can get, screwing over whoever else to get to the top. And this is years ago, but I was looking at something that mentioned that better leadership actually often comes from the type like B and C personalities that are a little more introverted at times. They're more listening instead of talking. They don't necessarily know how to sell themselves or represent themselves the best, but they are able to understand people better. They're able to connect dots better and have more what's called emotional intelligence. And so my main point here is that in the same way that like having more well-rounded personality types at all levels of business could drive better outcomes, I think the same is true for obviously running a country. And kind of in the same vein, our government is so saturated with business people. Those are really saturating our government. And I think that's causing echo chambers and just dysfunction. They don't only not have the knowledge and experience and tools to solve the problems that need solving, but because they're these like type A personalities, they don't necessarily want to listen to people who actually are equipped and do have the tools and the knowledge to actually solve these problems. And so what you're talking about in sortition, I feel like really solves some of those big issues by having a representative sample. It's not going to be all business owners. It's not going to be all type A personalities. It's going to be a really like an actual blend of people. And then this also solves problems with like Citizens United, because you're getting money out of politics. You're reducing echo chambers. When America was created, when the founding fathers drafted the Constitution and everything, they saw public service, elected positions as something that you would do for like a couple years and then you'd go back to your normal job. They did not envision like career politicians. I like that idea because I feel like when you're an elected official and that's your job, you kind of get into your own echo chamber instead of being a part of the actual populace and doing actual populist things. And again, tying back to what you've said earlier, just how people who actually can run already aren't necessarily a part of the general population. There's already some classism and stuff going on. So how can we realistically apply this in America? And what would it mean for like Congress or the politicians we do have right now? Would they be replaced? Is it complementary? How does all of that work?
I want to address this thing that you said a little earlier, like Yeah, in addition to elections sort of selecting against working people and caregivers and people who are not wealthy or well connected, they select for people who have like narcissistic or potentially sociopathic personality traits. Not saying that all politicians are sociopaths or narcissists, but there's a higher proportion of them among elected officials than there are among the general population. Quotes out there like, people who seek power are not the people who you want wielding power apply here, right? As far as like how this would apply to the United States. So there's like really two different types of classes of politician. There's legislators and there's executives. The executives have a huge influence on policy. And this is partially because our legislatures and Congress are so dysfunctional that like it ends up that the governor and the president, they have a ton of influence on policy. But really those don't need to be intertwined in the same way, where you could have like an executive that, they're good at managing people, good at finance, they're good at health policy, they're good at overseeing and like picking other experts to kind of like help them implement the will of the people, but they don't necessarily have to make the decisions themselves. So for me, I think I'm going to give you two answers. There's like the realistic path to like actually make this happen. And then there's like the final conception in my mind and in other people's minds in the movement about how this would look. So I'm going to answer the final conception question first. I think you're going to need people with special experience and skills to be the executives. Like you can't randomly select any old person who's going to have management skills and finance skills and policy skills in the same way that you could randomly select decision makers, right? So yeah, elections might still happen for those executives, or you might have like an election by jury type model where you have basically a large, group of maybe 100 people who are going to do one of the most thorough job interviews possible for all the people who are vying for an executive position, going to look into their background, make sure that they have the skills that they say that they have, and then that 100 people or whatever can kind of decide together which of the candidates they're going to hire to be the executive, right? And for those people, if they're doing a great job, then they should continue to be able to serve in that role, but they should have new like randomly selected panels basically every year doing a performance evaluation for them and saying like, yep, you're effectively implementing the will of the people and you're doing so in an ethical manner, and so you get to keep your job, right? On the other end of the spectrum, for like the goal of policy making, for legislatures, for parliaments, those are not necessarily decisions that have a right or a wrong answer. They are value decisions, right? It's like, how much money are we going to prioritize to X objective versus Y objective? Or, which thing do we think, which group, do we think is better to prioritize in policy? It's all about value, about the person's values and what the goals are, rather than like there's a technically correct answer here, right? So for those value decisions, it really does not make sense to have experts be making our value decisions for us, right? Like attempting to make someone else's value decisions for them is attempting to manipulate them. There's no way around that. And this like legislature, parliament role, they are standing in for us on our own values, right? Another thing that really is difficult about legislatures is like you want to be able to develop consensus, like to have like, okay, this group can't necessarily get everything they want and this group can't get everything they want, so let's come up with the best consensus we can get. But for politicians, they're like, the way they are selected, it is absolutely antithetical to coming up with consensus. Because it's like you're flip-flopping, right? You're going to answer to your base and say, oh yeah, I made concessions on X, Y, and Z. That's not going to win you any points. The thing that's going to win you points is like, no, I fought as hard as I could. I didn't change my mind because I already had all the right answers. Because you hired me for this job based on my answers to those questions, right? And so, like, unless they want to lose their job as an elected politician, like, they really can't change their mind about stuff. And that works directly against finding consensus or being able to, like, hammer together something that's actually going to work for the most people. So, executives, I think, should stay as, like, specialists, and they would probably be hired by election by jury type groups. But then like the policy itself, I think it really makes sense in like an ideal world for those to be decided by these citizens' assemblies, these sortition selected groups, and say like, okay, what is the best consensus that we can come up with on abortion policy? It's not going to make everybody happy, but what's the best compromise consensus we can come up with? And then executive, go ahead and implement that. right? And one other thing I want to say about that is like, I think for these randomly selected groups, the citizens' assemblies, I think it's a mistake to have the same randomly selected group making decision after decision after decision. The more time that they spend in that role, the more distinction they're going to have and the less they're going to represent the actual people, right? So really, ideally, we want these groups to serve like only for the length of a single decision. And there's this other really good idea about like separating the group that comes up with the policy proposal from the group that decides whether or not it becomes law. So maybe we have a group of 150 people that hammers out the best possible consensus on abortion, but then we have like a group of like 400 or 500 people hearing all the pro or con arguments about this policy that this group has come up with, and then they decide whether or not, yeah, this is better than the status quo and it passes, or it's worse than the status quo and we're going to keep the status quo, right? Because that group of 150 or whatever that comes up with the policy, they're of course going to be biased in favor of their own ideas, and they might be like, oh yeah, this is the best, this is the best compromise possible, but really they already have some distinction bias from the general population. So yeah.
Earlier when you were talking about how the executive branch just has so much power right now, it just got me thinking about how the legislature and judicial branches seem to, especially right now, they seem to be working against their own self-interest by ceding so much power to the executive branch instead of doing anything to defend their own turf and make sure that their roles are still relevant. But like, I was also thinking about what you're talking about, these like using these citizens' assemblies to develop laws. One problem we also have in government right now is that politicians only read so fast. There's only so many laws that they can do in a given month, year, term, whatever. By building citizens' assemblies focused on different laws or decisions, you could conceivably advance anything and everything at the same time, because you could be, different 100-person panels for whatever XYZ law or decision. And, we're in a country of like, now I'm on the spot. I want to say 300 million.
Yeah. And so, you can run multiple of these in parallel. Yeah, absolutely.
And you can make so much headway on actual progress or getting rid of a bunch of laws that just do not suit us anymore. You could actually keep up with technological trends, because that has been a big problem, is just like our laws are so outdated and our society, our culture, and our science and technology are advancing so quickly that the laws can't keep up. I am curious, though, how do regular folks, like in these citizens' assemblies, how do they get educated on the issues, or what role? Because I assume there is some like groundwork educational stuff happening so that they aren't just voting blindly on this.
Totally.
Ideally, they're having a well-rounded idea of like both sides and whatnot. So how does that work?
So absolutely there needs to be education. But the thing is, like, education is sort of like a paternalistic, to back up, it's sort of like we the organizers are smart, and you, the people that we've selected, are dumb, and we need to teach you all the things that there is to know about this subject, and then you make the decisions. That's not the way it should work, right? Like there should be like some general education topics about like, this is the way the law works, and this is like some different subject matter experts that are going to come and talk to you. But the process of becoming informed is really not so much a process of just listening to experts, because experts can be wrong about stuff as well, but opening our mind to the possibility that we are wrong and listening to different perspectives, right? And so there's a couple different things going on in like the learning phase of a citizens assembly, where experts are brought in with different perspectives, but then also the people who are selected should be able to select their own experts. Like say, hey, I saw this person talk about this and I want them to come and talk to the group. And then someone else would say, that expert that talks, I don't think they're trustworthy. I think we need to hear some context from somebody else. And so just really the process of becoming informed is, knowing that no one really has absolute truth on anything. Like the only way we can really make better decisions and become better informed is really opening our minds to the possibility that we're wrong, hearing different perspectives, and then coming up with the best working synthesis that we can. And I think the best versions of these sortition processes incorporate like, here's, a well-published expert on this topic, but then also you, the group, like, what do you think about this? And what are some other people that you would like to hear from? And let's bring those people in in and discover the nuance about this subject before we proceed to like make a decision about it.
I'm curious, this might be more of a psychiatry or psychology question, so if you can't answer it, it's fine. But do you have ideas for any ways to foster curiosity, foster a desire to just learn, like in these educational phases, as opposed to, a lot of people go in with their preconceived notions, their biases, and when they ask questions or when they say things, it's to defend their preconceived notions and strike down opposing notions. Is there a way to change that so that it's more that they are asking questions because they actually are interested in learning more and not interested in being right?
So I think elections kind of work against that mindset of being open to learn about stuff. Because if you're open to changing your mind, if you're open to the possibility that you're wrong, like that is not a very compelling thing to tell your base. Like, I might be wrong about this. Send me and I'll learn about the issue and I'll come up with some compromise with other people, right? They want someone like, no, I know exactly what we need to do on abortion and this is what we're going to do about it. So send me there and I'll make sure that happens, right? And I think random selection, the empirical evidence from the experience of these citizens' assemblies has been pretty positive as like, yes, you can't force people to have a mindset of like, I am not an expert and I'm here to like hear other people's perspectives and learn and come up with consensus. But the majority of people who end up in these processes through random selection kind of have that mindset built in. Like, if I, for instance, I keep using abortion as an example because I think it's something that like a lot of people might relate to, like, oh yeah, that's a policy. There's not necessarily a right or wrong answer, an objectively right or wrong answer, but there's strong policy opinions about it, right? Ireland had this citizens' assembly in the late 2010s where they had, as a country, as a very Catholic country, they had a constitutional prohibition against abortion. And it was a pretty strict prohibition against it. And it was causing problems for like health of the mother, life of the mother, viability. Like their abortion is an issue that has nuance and really dealing with it in a black and white way and policy is probably the wrong approach. But the Irish politicians were not handling it because they, as well-connected, wealthy individuals, they were strongly connected to the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church said, no, abortion is never okay, and so that's the way it stayed in Ireland. But mounting pressure was being put upon these politicians like, no, the current constitutional prohibition is really not working in the favor of the Irish people. And so that pressure allowed them to be like, okay, we're going to call a citizens' assembly because we kind of want to wash our hands of this issue. And it's going to be what they decide, not us, the politicians, so the Catholic Church can't get mad at us, right? And so they brought this randomly selected group of Irish citizens and they heard from experts, and that's a pretty broad definition of experts. They heard from physicians and policy experts and people who've had abortions and people who are advocating against keeping the restriction in place. And the vast majority of the people in this group, like they said, yeah, I did go in with my preconceived notions, but I wasn't sure I was right. Like, I don't have as much experience as that person who had an abortion, or this person who their relative had an abortion and they wish that they wouldn't have, or they didn't have this like direct experience. And so walking into that, they had the humility to be like, I don't know everything about this, and these are some scenarios I didn't think of. And then what they came out with was a pretty solid compromise that the Irish people overwhelmingly approved. So I think it's hard to force people to have an open mindset, but I think the random selection bit like kind of gives people the idea that you need to be humble. You were selected not due to your merits, but totally at random. And I think people feel the humility of that situation that they're in.
We're talking about how elections don't really foster a learning mindset. So during this election, I was interested in a candidate and I was talking to someone online about it. And one of the things that they said that's kind of stuck with me is they wanted the other candidate because they felt that candidate had more experience, and they criticized me for wanting the candidate I wanted because of their agenda, even though they were inexperienced. And my response to that was, well, this candidate might not have as much experience, but they have experts they can lean on. They're a proactive person. They'll ask the questions that needed to be asked in order to develop great policy. They already have some great ideas, and they'll have city council members to lean on, people who have been doing
Right.
the day-to-day running of government and things like that. And the basic response was like, I think you're just trying to make yourself feel better for voting for someone who's inexperienced. That's like mind-blowing to me, because why would I want someone who's experienced in the wrong things? The agenda is the whole point. Even if you have the knowledge and the expertise, if it's moving you in the wrong direction, or if it's moving the city, the state, the country in the wrong direction, it doesn't matter. It
Right.
doesn't matter at all. So it's kind of interesting that you bring that up, because I do see that it doesn't just impact, the politicians, it impacts the voting electorate. Instead of voting for people who are more open-minded or who would compromise, as long as someone who has all the experience and all the answers and all the expertise, even though that's impossible, that's what they'll go for. So I really liked what you were saying there. And I do think sortition, it sounds like, would solve that issue in a lot of ways. Like, I would hope it would foster a more collaborative environment instead of competitive environment.
Yeah, and we just wouldn't have to take like the agenda and the execution as a package deal, right? Like, if we have someone who, we have really good ideas, we have an agenda that we want to put forward, but that's attached to a person who's a terrible manager, who has like a very type A personality that can't get along with other people. And so then do I vote for that person with the agenda that I like, who I think's a bit of an ass? And, because really, like for this election that just happened, where we were electing like mayors and things like that kind of role, like, absolutely, you need to have good personnel management skills. And in order to be an effective mayor, you need to have that skill. But there's not a way to like separate this person. Seem like they have good personnel management and they're going to keep people on task and work well with other people. And then there's this agenda that we may or may not like, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. So your organization is currently called Democracy Without Elections.
That's correct.
And it has been running for how long? And you guys just did something in Los Angeles, correct? With Sortition?
Yeah.
Talk about that.
Yeah, exactly. Democracy Without Elections was founded in the late 2010s, initially as a chapter of this international organization called the Sortition Foundation. But yeah, we're our own 501c3 nonprofit, and we have chapters all over the place. We're still a pretty small organization. Recently, our Los Angeles chapter, Public Democracy LA, PDLA, had a really important win where the City Council of Los Angeles has kind of been in turmoil for the last couple of years because one of their council members was caught on tape saying some racist and just unfortunate comments. And it was like, there's something wrong with city government. And it brought to light these other concerns about like kind of having corrupt insider deals. And that's like all been building towards we need charter reform, which is like for a city, a charter is their constitution, right? And Public Democracy LA has successfully advocated for using a sortition process in the updating of Los Angeles's charter. So one of the most powerful cities in the United States is going to be using a sortition process to update their charter. And it's a huge win for PDLA and Democracy Without Elections. And it's really exciting. I think a lot of people are not aware that that's going to be happening, but it's a huge win for us, and we'd love to see things like that around the country and other places, because those types of processes can, one, increase familiarity, and then also kind of build expertise in like, how did this process go, and what are things we can learn about for next time. At this point, there have been citizens' assemblies and sortition processes all over the world, but I think the more experience and the more familiarity that regular people have with it, the more expertise and the more enthusiasm we can bring to bear on the problem of like, how do we scale this up? How do we apply this to really the biggest problems in our society and our country?
So on that note, how do people start this in their own like towns or cities or states, whatever? How do we get started with making sortition happen other places?
So in the places that it's been tried and given real power, it's almost always been a situation where the politicians had like a messy issue that they did not want to deal with, right? So we talked about abortion for Ireland. Another example is like, if you remember the yellow vest movement in France, like the President Macron was trying to push forward a carbon tax, but not realizing or not appreciating that that carbon tax was going to punish poorer people, working class people who are using their cars to drive into the city of Paris to like do their job, right? And all the wealthy people who already own real estate in downtown, like they're not going to be as affected. And so it's like this carbon tax, which, to be fair, I think a carbon tax is needed and important, but the way it was implemented, it was really going to harm like all of the working class people who have to commute, who are way out in the suburbs. So there's this huge unrest in France, right? And so you want to take advantage of moments like that, where like the politicians really are thought to be like, they should not be handling this issue. Possible subject matter that this would be a good target for would be like redistricting or campaign finance rules, or things where politicians have like an inherent conflict of interest, writing the rules for themselves, right? So if you can identify an issue like this in your city or your state, and you're like, really, politicians have a conflict of interest here, who can we trust? And a randomly selected group of the people is probably the best alternative, right? Or really the best choice. And so I think those types of political targets are the right thing to be aiming for. Political hot potatoes like abortion, and then these direct inherent conflict of interest. If you're interested in trying to make this happen in your locality, like we would love for you to join Democracy Without Elections, and all of us would love to like lend expertise on helping to make this happen wherever you live. Because wherever this happens, it helps to spread the idea, and that's right aligned with our mission, right? For like the biggest questions, like, our goal is not necessarily just to use these as one-off types, like, let's fix this thorny issue for the politicians, then give them back the power. The thing that's critical for me is I know that maybe, the United States is not ready to say like, oh, we're going to get rid of the legislature and we're going to select the president by this election by jury thing, and we're going to have all these individual policies made by sortition bodies. Like, I know that's not going to happen in my lifetime necessarily, or certainly not overnight. And so the way to, I think, make that happen long term, or really to just get the best compromise that people can come up with, is to put sortition bodies instead in charge of updating the system, writing the rules for our rulers, engaging in recurring, like regularly scheduled constitutional reform. So that in moments where we are now, where it's like something is wrong, the Constitution is being interpreted in all of these different ways because it's such an old document and there's really not a lot of clarity. And so we have like originalists versus like people who believe the Constitution should be adapted to the way that we live now. But really, it should be in black and white, like what we should be doing, because not having it in black and white leaves open to crazy interpretations that are not necessarily serving the people, right? So the Constitution needs to be updated more often than we in the United States have. And so I think like the perfect implementation for sortition, what I would like to happen is that we use like really well-designed sortition bodies to reform the Constitution or make changes and adjustments to the Constitution over time on a regular basis. Because I think with that approach, you might have people say, this isn't working. We need to get rid of Citizens United. And so that's going to happen. And if that's enough, and then the politicians are serving the interests of the people, well, then that's just fine. We don't need to do anything else. But if then they find out, we really need to change that first past the post voting method, and we need to try something like approval voting or star voting or Condorcet voting or ranked choice voting or whatever, okay, now we can make that adjustment. And then keep making adjustments as needed until we have a system that large representative random samples of the people say like, yeah, actually, I don't think we can do any better than this. Let's just keep doing this, right?
Aside from, reaching out to your organization, what would be kind of the best path to take to enable sortition at the local level, besides capitalizing on like these hot button issues or emergency problems? Is it reaching out to like the council and being like, hey, here's an idea for you if you want to like wash your hands of this? Or is it like organizing a local group to kind of advance this issue, or like putting an op-ed in the paper? Or what is kind of the best method of making this happen locally? Like, where should you go?
I think both of the approaches that you described are useful. Politicians, as people who are, whether they say this or not, they are self-interested in maintaining their own jobs, right? Just like all of us are. If this is how I'm getting paid and this is how, where my status comes from, like absolutely I want to maintain my own position. And that's why there's so much focus among politicians about re-election, right? They spend so much time fundraising and planning for their re-election. So, as far as like approaching a city council and saying like, hey, here's this thorny issue. Like, don't you wish you did not have to deal with this and could pass this off to someone and like wash your hands of this issue? I think that is a great approach. It doesn't change the underlying like balance of power, between like this group that has more ability to win elections, who are wealthy and well-connected and don't have to work and don't have to caregive, and the rest of us. But it's a really good demonstration project because where these have happened, like generally people are very supportive of them. Like the Paris Citizens Climate Assembly. The main criticism that I've heard from French people and Parisians was like the president ignored like more than half of these recommendations or ignored a significant number of them. But what the Citizens Assembly came up with was excellent, right? I think it's useful to approach politicians as their ally and say like, hey, we all want good policies and this is a win for you, right? This is the thorny issue you can wash your hands of and let the people decide. And that's great. And the politician can look like a hero and we can get good policy and we can spread the idea of like, maybe this is actually the real way we should scale democracy rather than having elite middlemen make our value decisions for us, right? So I think that approach is great. I think eventually we are going to need like a mass pressure campaign of some sort to have, probably we're going to have to like, it's the future is always unclear and any attempt to significantly change the US government is going to be insanely difficult and has a very low probability of success. But I think there's still a path forward here where we could say like, okay, at some point, if we really want to have like that recurring people's jury convention, like a people's sortition convention that's going to like be in charge of making sure our Constitution continues to serve us, the people, what we're going to need is something like a pressure campaign where we get people to run on a platform of like, hey, I'm going to run for state legislature. If you elect me, then I'm going to call for the People's Jury Convention. I'm going to call for this sortition-based constitutional convention that's going to let the people of the United States like actively work on updating the Constitution on a recurring basis. And that's going to take a lot of mobilization, people voting in the primaries, people like kicking out incumbents and saying like, no, really, politicians should not be writing their own rules. And in the cases of constitutions, which are like the rules for our rulers, we really need sortition. We really need to use we the people and not our rulers to be updating those rules because they have inherent conflicts of interest in updating those things because everyone wants to keep their job, right? And that's borne out in campaign finance, that's borne out in redistricting, that's borne out in term limits, all sorts of things where, politicians have their incentives are aligned against making the right decision as far as limiting their own power.
Speaking of the constitutional convention, describe how paths that can actually change the Constitution, because I'm kind of curious, what is the easiest path to actually reforming the Constitution? Would it be possible with one well done amendment or reform to make these recurring sortition updates happen, and what the easiest path to actually having that happen is?
I wish there was an easier path. All the paths to that goal are incredibly difficult. There's two paths that are delineated in the US Constitution. One is what's called the typical or congressional amendment process. And that's where 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate agree on some amendment. And that then sends the amendment to get ratified. And in order to get ratified, it needs to pass either the legislatures or conventions in 3/4 of the states. So huge supermajority thresholds to pass, even to get the idea in front of the states. And then once it's in front of the states, you got to pass 3/4 of the states have to sign off on it, right? The other path has never been used, but it's called an Article 5 Constitutional Convention. And the way that would work is you need 2/3 of the states to say, yes, we want a constitutional convention. And there's disagreement from constitutional theorists and lawyers saying whether or not that constitutional convention can be restricted. Right now, there's a group called Convention of States, which is sort of like a far right group. They are saying we want a constitutional convention, but only to consider term limits and the budget it. But there's other constitutional theorists and lawyers who have said, really, you cannot restrict a constitutional convention. Once a convention is called, like, they can consider any possible amendments. Democrats have like fear-mongered about that and be like, well, they're going to take away the Bill of Rights. And yeah, so good luck. Don't vote for that constitutional convention. But that's probably not accurate either, because a constitutional convention, the amendments that come out of that convention still have to be ratified in the same way as the traditional congressional path, where 3/4 of the states have to sign off on the amendment for it to become law. The Constitution is vague. It says that that ratification in the state level can either happen from the state legislature or a convention at the state level can do it. And the convention is not really defined. And so at Democracy Without Elections, we have some draft legislation, like model legislation, that people could try to get passed in their state that's basically working within our current constitutional framework to say, like, those state level constitutional conventions, those are going to be sortition bodies. So instead of having your state legislature decide this amendment passes or it doesn't, you're going to have 500 randomly selected people from the state of wherever you are, hear the pro and con arguments against each amendment, and then decide whether each one passes via private vote. I think, this is potentially a controversial statement. There's not any easy path to change the Constitution, but I think that even though it's never been done, the Article 5 Constitutional Convention is potentially an easier way to pull off this particular goal, this sortition goal, because state legislative seats are easier to flip than House seats or Senate seats. It takes less money, and in like strongly like partisan, like red or blue states like Utah and Idaho, where we are, if you have enough people show up in the Republican primary, you might flip that seat without having to do anything in the general, right? And for many state legislative seats, that would only be a couple thousand people in the single thousands that you would need to make a real change happen. So I think there is a potential strategy to work within the partisan primaries of whatever dominant party is in control and push people both in the Republican primaries and Democratic primaries to say, like, oh yeah, the type of candidate we need is one that's going to call for this constitutional convention, and then we're just going to get everyone, regardless of their ideology, to show up in those partisan primaries, and we can flip that seat. Right.
Excellent. I love that. This has been a great discussion. Did you have anything you kind of wanted to add in closing?
If you're interested in learning more, like, you don't necessarily have to be committed to the idea of sortition. If you're just like, this is an interesting idea to you and you would like to like talk about it with people, or maybe you have a different perspective that you're like, hey, I think you're wrong for this reason. Like, I was convinced of sortition in the process of like trying to figure out, okay, should I be working for ranked choice voting or approval voting or star voting? I got drawn into this basically because I was like, the government is dysfunctional and I think the problem is the voting method. And so I was volunteering with Represent Us, and then someone from Utah Approves actually said, like, hey, actually, have you heard of approval voting? Because there's these technical superiorities for approval voting and it's simpler. So that's like, okay, I had my mind open to potentially being wrong. And then I was like pleasantly surprised, like, oh yeah, approval voting does seem superior to ranked choice voting. And then maybe star or Condorcet voting are superior to approval, and then I think just keeping my mind open was the thing that eventually brought me to sortition. And it just like clicked for me. I work in public health, and part of my job is as like an epidemiologist. And so I work with representative random samples. We need to represent a population, and we're going to use representative random samples. Like, oh, this makes perfect sense. Why did I not think of this earlier? But because I feel like that mindset has done a lot of good things for me, I want to keep my mind open to the possibility that I'm wrong. So if you want to debate me, or if you want to try to change my mind, or if you're just like, hey, I want to just talk this out more with somebody, join us at Democracy Without Elections. We have a Discord server, and you can just chat with us without having to become a member or signing up for our email list if you'd like to. And then if you're wanting to hear what I think is a fantastic free book about sortition, and it goes into the history and the psychology and mechanics of like sortition versus politicians. The Trouble with Elections by Terry Bericius is available on Substack for free. I would really highly recommend that book. Eventually, it is in the process of being published, and once the publisher puts it out there, it will no longer be available for free on Substack, but he's going to make it free in some other way. And so just keep in touch with Democracy Without Elections, and we'll find a way for you to read that book for free because it's fantastic. So my main takeaways are like, if you're interested, you don't have to be committed to the idea. My two take homes would be like, consider joining Democracy Without Elections, and consider reading The Trouble with Elections by Terry Berecious.
Awesome. Love it. And whatever you do, make sure to get more involved in your local, state, and national politics either way.
Totally.
That's my takeaway.
Right.
Thank you so much for joining us, Ian. I greatly appreciate it. And I really hope Sortition, honestly, I hope it spreads. It sounds like a great idea.
Thanks so much, Casey.
Did you enjoy this video? Hit like on YouTube or rate the podcast 5 stars on Spotify if you did. And share it if you think it could help others. Please also subscribe, check out my other videos, even if it's just as white noise, or support the channel via buymeacoffee.com/rockmarketingllc. I love learning, talking with people, and sharing ideas that can benefit anyone who listens. Your support helps me keep creating and covering the costs that go into making this content. Please drop any questions in the comment section and suggest yourself as a guest if you have a topic you're passionate about. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to sharing more with you soon.